Reverend Dr. Jim Antal, and I'm coming to you now from Norwich, Vermont, in the United States. I'm an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, which is generally regarded as the most progressive Christian denomination in the States. And I serve as the special advisor on climate justice to the general minister and president of our denomination. By sharing with you the ways in which my spiritual or moral philosophy informs my work. Since my college years, I've participated in the first Earth Day and in every Earth Day since, and I've been an environmental activist now for these 50 years, committed to the transformative power of nonviolence and to the wisdom and truth that emerges from interfaith solidarity. So here are several religious and moral themes that inform my life and witness. At the core of every world religion is a common affirmation often referred to as the Golden Rule. We are to love our neighbors as ourselves. A central theme in my book, Climate Church, Climate World, is the recognition that the religions of the world need to enlarge their understanding of who counts as neighbor. We need to recognize unborn future generations as our neighbors every bit as much as we recognize the person sitting next to us in the pew as our neighbor. Another central theme in my book and in my activism is the recognition, as Psalm 121 says, that the earth is the Lord's, and thus it's not ours to wreck. A related theme focuses on the fundamental covenant humanity has with God, a covenant articulated in Genesis chapter 9. Humanity's covenant is not only with God, but also with all living things and with future generations. Yet another theme centers on the love and justice that Jesus manifests, an inclusive love and justice that embraces all people as well as all living things. Following his example throughout my ministry, I have supported LGBTQIA rights and ministries, as well as the intersectionality of climate justice, racial justice, and economic justice. And finally, I regard love as the most powerful force on earth. We need to look no farther than the life and witness of Congressman John Lewis to see this. In my book, in my sermons, and in my keynotes, I share my view that God is calling our generation to make nonviolent civil disobedience a normative expression of discipleship, every bit as much as prayer. So I want to share with you a few comments about the current climate crisis and the cutting edge thinking associated with it that I find compelling. And let me begin by sharing some of the bad news of cutting edge thinking on the climate crisis. Here are just a few updates from the newest science. Record heat in the Arctic is causing unprecedented wildfires. Last month in Siberia, above the Arctic Circle, the temperature was over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Coastal flooding is worsening much more and much faster than was predicted only a few years ago. Earth's atmosphere is nearing levels of CO2 not seen in over 15 million years. The last time CO2 was at similar levels, temperatures were between 5 and 7 degrees Fahrenheit hotter, and sea levels were 65 feet higher. And recent research shows that extremely hot summers are now 200 times more likely than they were only 50 years ago. Now that leads me to what is my greatest concern. Environmental journalist David Roberts writes about it And Greta Thunberg warns us more effectively than anyone. And here's the concern. Perhaps humanity will never actually wake up. Humanity has an extraordinary ability to adapt, to get on with it, to dwell in the past. This has been, not to dwell in the past. This has been enormously useful throughout our evolutionary history. But now our ability to adapt makes it difficult for us to keep our attention focused on how much is changing, how much is being lost. Instead, we adapt to the so-called new normal. Since 2006, I've been telling pastors that if religious leaders don't repurpose the church to address the climate crisis within a decade, the only use people will have for religion will be to express our grief over the world we let go. A final example of bad news is failed leadership, especially federal leadership in the United States. For example, the recent rollback of the 50-year-old National Environmental Policy Act. Among other things, this will allow pipelines to be built with much less public input. Another example is President Trump's rollback of over 100 rules protecting clean air and water, and other rules that aim to reduce the threat of human-caused climate change. Now, here is some cutting-edge good news. First, we've learned some important lessons from the COVID crisis. Humanity is capable of making major changes to how we live very quickly. We need to recognize this as a superpower and immediately exercise this superpower to embrace the changes science says we must to avoid climate catastrophe. The other lesson we've learned from the COVID crisis is that we are all in this together. Okay, we haven't fully learned this one yet. We can only hope that those clinging to rugged individualism will somehow trade it in for interdependence. Now, another piece of cutting-edge good news is that scientists and engineers have all done their work. For example, Mark Z. Jacobson from Stanford has shown that it's perfectly possible for every state in the US and well over 150 countries to transition to 100% wind, solar, and water renewable clean energy by 2035, and that doing so will create millions of jobs and save trillions of dollars. And the final piece of cutting-edge good news is that people are realizing that we are now living in a world where our most significant moral challenges are intersectional. They are not separate and distinct from one another. Systemic racism has been choking America for centuries. As 15-year-old climate activist Alexandria Villaseñor puts it, the exploitation of Black people is the greatest extractive system of production of all time. Thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement, many churches and other houses of worship have begun to examine their white privilege and how their white privilege is secured by the guardrails of injustice, inequity, and inequality. They're also learning what Black and Brown and Indigenous people living in America have known for generations, that they are living their lives amidst a public health crisis. Not only that, we're all realizing that we are no longer living on the same planet we used to call home. And Black and Brown and Indigenous people know this best because they are already dealing with the consequences of the climate crisis, which is to say that climate change is no longer a future event, it's happening now. So I want to share with you a few of the actions that I consider most important, actions that I believe every congregation must engage. And of course, this could be different at some future date, but I'm sharing these with you as I sit here in July 2020. First of all, we need to make our houses of worship safe enough and relevant enough so that we can do three things. First, clergy need to preach on the climate emergency and on the intersectionality of racial, economic, and climate justice. We need to preach as if life itself depends on it, because it does. Second, we need to hear each other's testimony. Couldn't we make room every single time we gather for worship to hear a member of the congregation share with that congregation something that they or their family have done in order to address the climate crisis? And wouldn't that be one of the most important things we could do in connecting ourselves with God? Third, we need to process our grief. Only then can we recognize the existential dread we are experiencing can serve us as a precondition of the hope we need and we need to give to the younger generation. As people of faith, we need to resist the building of all new fossil fuel infrastructure. This was one of the points of a resolution passed in 2017 by the National Synod of the United Church of Christ. I wrote that resolution, and it called for the beginning of a new moral era. And one manifestation of that would be the resisting of all new fossil fuel infrastructure. Last time I checked, most congregations are within 3 to 5 miles of a pipeline or a railroad track. And as many of you already know, railroad tracks are the new pipelines, and they are used for transporting oil and coal and other fossil fuels. And then finally, as people of faith, we need to stop the money pipeline. As my friend Bill McKibben says, money is the oxygen on which the fire of climate change burns. In the 8 years since the movement to divest from fossil fuel companies was launched by Bill McKibben, portfolios worth over $14 trillion have purged their holdings of fossil fuel stocks. Any congregation with an endowment should divest of their fossil fuel stock holdings. And congregations should consider something that I talk about in my book, Climate Church, Climate World, which is to convene truth and reconciliation conversations around the ownership of fossil fuel stock. If you want to learn more about that, have a look at my book. And then finally, all of us can join the movement to make JP Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo and other major banks stop lending money to fossil fuel companies so that they can continue to wreck our common home. If you want to learn more about this, visit the website Stop the Money Pipeline. That all of humanity alive at this moment have been called to just such a time as this. And accepting that humanity is now united by a common vocation. With joy in our hearts, let us commit our time, our talents, our assets, and our bodies to restore God's great gift of creation. My name is Reverend Dr. Jim Antal, and I'm coming to you today from Norwich, Vermont, in the United States. I'm ordained as a United Church of Christ minister. The United Church of Christ is generally regarded as the most progressive of the Christian denominations in the United States. I'm also the author of a 2018 book, Climate Church, Climate World, that hundreds, maybe even thousands of congregations are now reading and studying. I serve now as the special advisor on climate justice to the general minister and president of our denomination, the United Church of Christ. And if there was one thing that I could say to every person who is listening and watching this at this moment, it would be this. And I want to begin by quoting my friend Bill McKibben. We need to stop being individuals. And so the positive urging I want to give you is to join with another person. The climate crisis is way too big for any of us to contemplate confronting alone. Join with at least one other person. Find a group near yourself. There are so many. Try to unite across generations. That's what my denomination has been doing. While we've been uniting with chapters from 350.org and from the Extinction Rebellion and from the Sierra Club, you can do that personally too. And what you will find is that the Holy Spirit will fill you with power in order to resist climate change and bring forth a restored creation.